Hello, my name is Jeff Poisson and welcome to my channel. I was born in Durban, South Africa in 1985, and growing up as a white male in a post-apartheid South Africa involved a lot of feelings of guilt without really understanding the reasons why. By the time I entered school, many of the legal structures that were supporting apartheid had been dismantled, and so right from my first year of school, my classmates were a mixture of races and cultures. Although I couldn't really see anything around me which looked like what I would imagine to be racism, there was still a lot of guilt that was projected onto me and other white children as we learned that us whites had enslaved Native Africans, established apartheid regime, and were responsible for unimaginable cruelty. Now, today, in 2022, it's 20 years plus since apartheid ended in South Africa and 70 years since the civil rights movement in the United States of America. I have the impression, though, that racism today is much more talked about than ever before in history. And so this is something quite strange, and obviously it's possible to see how a white person, a white South African male, talking about racism could be problematic. Um, but I'd really like to share a perspective of racism that's perhaps not often considered. So today, me personally, I'm constantly encountering this narrative that all white people are racist, that we have to continue to apologize for racism, for slavery, and our white privilege. Students and employees are often reporting about being forced into these anti-racism training sessions, which convey similar messages. In South Africa, where I'm from, affirmative action is still very much alive in the form of BEE, which is Black Economic Empowerment, which forces equity, not equality, but equity through race, a race quota system. So just as a side note, equity with a capital E is a word gone through a kind of interlocution by the wokists. So it now means correcting the discrimination of the past through discrimination in the present, rather than what people might think of as equality, which is treating everyone the same. That was just a small aside. Then, of course, there is also this Black Lives Matter movement and all the controversy surrounding that, and particularly the organization with the same name. And perhaps the most troubling aspect for me is the conflation and the blurring of lines between the concepts of racism, gender ideology, and freedom of speech. So before I continue, I'd just like to say that this video is in no way denying that racism or white privilege exists. There are certainly truly horrific crimes which continue to be committed on a daily basis due to racial prejudice and discrimination. But what I do want to do in this video is just to share my personal experience regarding the theme of racism, share some biographical anecdotes about my life to sort of frame the context from which I understand and see race. And then in the second half of the video, I'd like to reflect on modern racism, which might be more appropriately termed postmodern racism. So I'd like to talk about my family to start with. So my maternal grandfather, so my mother's father, he was quite an interesting man. He was a descendant of the original 1820 European settlers that arrived in South Africa. And he grew up in a part of South Africa called Dundee during the 30s and 40s. And during his childhood on his family farm, the only other children with which he had to play with were the local Zulu children. And so, as a result, he was perfectly bilingual, speaking both English and isiZulu as a native speaker. after my parents got a divorce when I was 5, my mother, sister, and I moved in with my grandparents, so my mother's parents. And as was fairly common practice in that area where I grew up, which is called KwaZulu-Natal on the east coast of South Africa, we had a gardener and a cleaning lady who lived in a small cottage on our land, on our premises, and they were both Zulu. My grandparents, they were the ones that managed the gardener and the cleaning lady, and so I grew up watching them, interacting with them, and they always treated them with a lot of respect, always speaking to them in their language, isiZulu, making sure that they were taken care of, and even providing assistance to their families in times of need. And we had a cleaning lady that lived with us for my entire childhood and adolescence. She was a really lovely lady, very humble and kind Zulu woman who she always had a smile on her face. She was a devout Christian and had very strong moral values. And she was with my family from before I was born till after I moved out. So she was always a feature of my childhood, of my life, and she really felt like part of the family. And it really would be hard to imagine my life without her in it. When I talk, so I live now in France and I work in Switzerland, and when I talk to Europeans about this, they feel very uncomfortable. They For them, it's almost like we're keeping slaves on the property to work for us. But in South Africa, the practice of having a cleaning lady and a gardener, especially living on the premise, it's very hard for Europeans to imagine. So in South Africa, there's a very, very high unemployment rate. People will work for will do almost any job to try and support their family. There's a lot of desperation, a lot of poverty, and a lot of the time these people that are what we call domestic workers, they travel very long distances. They live far away. They come nearer to the big cities to work at people's homes and then send money back to their families. And so because of this large distance, it just works out better for everyone involved for them to live on the property or very close by. And in South Africa, we have a lot of land, and our gardens are a lot larger than what I've seen here in Europe. And so very often there are these little cottages or granny flats, and this tends to be then where the domestic workers will stay during the week or for the days that they're working. So it's really not at all equivalent to imagining keeping slaves. It's just it's an unusual working arrangement from the perspective of a European, or I imagine maybe an American. Just regarding my grandfather's treatment of the gardener and cleaning lady, so although the majority of my grandfather's life occurred during the apartheid regime, I really would be hard pressed to come up with any incidents of him being racist or behaving rather in a racist way. Maybe with the exception of when he was truly frustrated, the odd off-color slur. But really, that was it. And so it's interesting to see that that his whole life was sort of based upon this apartheid regime. He grew up with the Zulu people, and yet that didn't cause him to be a racist in the way that we might imagine today. Now, by the time I started my schooling, and you can see there's me, my first year of school in red, in the red circle. Um, so by that stage, many of the systemic structures that were supporting apartheid had already been dismantled. And from the first year of primary school, I was in a mixed race class. And so the whole generation that I grew up with um, had no first-hand experience of the type of segregation which was characteristic of the apartheid regime. So in this specific class, I lived in a neighborhood where in a city called Durban, and Durban it has the highest concentration of Indians outside of India, and so here in my class, although you don't see um, any African children, you do see Indian children. Um, in my future classes, then we had more and more African children also joining, but that part of South Africa was a very high Indian population. And as a child, I didn't know any different, and I never really thought much about race or racism, apart from perhaps noticing different accents. So, for example, the Indian population in Durban, they have a very specific. It's not really a dialect, maybe it's a pidgin or a Creole, but they have a very specific way of talking, a very specific accent. Um, so I probably noticed accents more than I noticed race. And I make the distinction um, because saying that they had an accent or a way of speaking, this is a generalization. And so it might be true for the majority of Indians living in Durban, but certainly by no means all of them. So um, there were a few that um, spoke just like me, that where there was no obvious difference culturally, the way we spoke, accent-wise, between me the and some of the other Indian children. Um, the naughty kids at school, they tended to be a mixture of different races. So I never thought about, oh, this race is naughty or that race is naughty. And we had white kids which were getting in trouble just as often as black kids or Indian kids, and so that that didn't seem to play a part in my thinking as a child. And my family were also devout Christians, and so at church that we attended, there was always a mixture of races, and all of which were treated with love and respect. Obviously, my experience it can't be generalized to every South African, but from my personal experience at least, race was just not a thing during my early childhood in South Africa. And in fact, the first time I told a girl I liked her in primary school, it was an Indian girl in my class. When I tell people I'm from South Africa, most of them the only thing they know about South Africa is apartheid and Nelson Mandela. And I think almost all South Africans have quite a fondness of Mandela. So the first time that I can really remember race being a topic or a thing that I was thinking about was when I was in the third year of primary school, so grade 3. I was 8 years old. And at that time, there were the presidential elections, and Nelson Mandela was announced as the next president of the Republic of South Africa. And at that moment, absolute chaos pursued, at least that's what it felt like for me. Um, I was constantly hearing the adults talking about what it would mean for the whites now that there was a black president. A number of my friends left with their families um, for the United States, for UK, for Australia, and there was this mention on the radio of a mass exodus of whites who were afraid of possible retaliation against them by the black population, who were obviously the overwhelming majority against the whites. Um, so in South Africa, the whites make up, and also I really hate this term of whites, blacks, etc. But let's say the European South Africans, they make up about only 9% of the population. So they're really in the minority. So, so this is why they really feared this large majority could easily overpower them, have retaliation for the sins of the past, essentially. Now, despite this apparent pervasive panic, when I when I did see the president on the television, I only saw good things about him. So, um, and he was affectionately known as Madiba by South Africans, and I remember he always had this very warm smile when he spoke, and he spoke in a very gentle, calm, soothing manner, and he seemed to really genuinely be promoting peace. Some other things I remember about him was he was always fond of wearing these very brightly colored shirts, which I liked, and it just felt new and different because it didn't look like any politician that I'd ever seen before. And he would he would often do this little dance, which became known as the Madiba Shuffle. Anyway, about 2 years into his presidency, there was the TRC, which was established, and that stands for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, the goal of the TRC was to hold public trials that were publicly broadcast on television of those from the previous regime who were now judged to have committed human rights violations. I remember my family would gather to watch these Truth and Reconciliation Commission court cases or judgments or procedures, whatever the correct term is, I no longer remember. But at the time, I remember having some mixed feelings about these televised hearings. I remember starting to feel guilt that I was white, and embarrassed about what we had done. I also remember starting to think that I didn't feel South African, but more like an unwanted foreigner in this country. And I also had the feeling that this was more about revenge than justice. Um, and it was probably some kind of show that was just put on to make the general public feel better. Now, as an adult looking back, I see how perhaps it was necessary for the government to make some kind of show of power regarding correcting the wrongs of the past. But I feel that it started a kind of domino effect leading to this new kind of racism in South Africa of the affirmative action sort. So after primary and secondary school, I started my tertiary education in 2004 at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I was doing at the time a bachelor's degree majoring in psychology and computer science, which was quite an unusual combination. I suppose it still is, with minors in music theory, statistics, and cognitive science. It was quite an eclectic bachelor's degree. And at the beginning of 2015, so when I was in second year, one day I was waiting in line to register for one of the second year courses, and the queue was quite long. I was waiting quite a while already, and I started to get hungry. So I asked another student in front of me to please keep my place in line while I quickly went to get something to eat. And I knew that, so there was a building next to us, and just on the other side of that building, I knew there was a kiosk that sold hot dogs. So I was feeling a bit lazy, so I didn't want to walk all the way around the building. I thought, okay, I'll just cut through the middle of the building. So I entered through the back. I walked through the central courtyard of the building to the front entrance, and this was quite an old, large building that you see in the picture here called Howard College. And you can see these doors here, these big wooden paneled doors, quite large, quite heavy, and they were closed. And I tried to open it, and it wouldn't open, and I just assumed it was stuck because they're quite old. So I heaved really hard on the doors, and they burst open. And at that moment, when the doors opened, I suddenly realized there was a sudden silence, and and that the background ambient noise, which I wasn't previously aware of, suddenly stopped. And as I looked down these stairs that you see here, leading down from the door, um, on in front of the building, there was just this sea of people, and specifically black people. As I looked through the crowd, I saw some of them holding up these banners, these posters that some of them read "Down with white supremacy," others simply said "Down with the whites." Um, and I realized, oh, um, this is a political march. This is a rally against whites, white supremacy, white privilege, white power, whatever you want to call it. And I I felt myself being stared at next to me, and as I looked to my side, to the right, I realized that the top of the stairs they'd converted into a kind of makeshift stage for this protest rally, and just a few feet from to my right, there was a black guy who holding a microphone, just staring at me, mouth open. Um, I guess he wasn't expecting me to make an appearance. Certainly not me being me. And and then I remember suddenly thinking that I was in danger. This is not a good place for a white male to be, and I could very easily turn into some kind of sacrificial scapegoat. So I took a few steps back, closed the door, and ran. Um, and that that was one of many incidents where I really felt unsafe at the university for being a white man. Um, and although it's quite funny to think about now, at the time it really felt dangerous. I was scared, and I was worried I would be targeted by the students. Um, Also, looking back now, I think it's interesting to consider that most of those people that were at that rally were my age. And so from my generation, that the same generation, like I explained, that had never seen with their own eyes apartheid or its extreme segregation. Yet here they were protesting against something that they had never experienced firsthand. And of course, there were and continue to be um, lingering effects of those of the apartheid regime, but it really is over. It does not exist, and and so for me, it always seemed bizarre to see people my age talking about the fight, fighting the fight against apartheid, and I always assumed it was a kind of inherited victimhood from their parents or families, or just from their group identity as being a black South African. Um, but regardless of whether or not myself or these others participated in the original game of South Africa of apartheid, um, now it feels like we're forced participants in this new game, which is very artificial and it feels quite unhealthy. It's also sorry, just going back here, it's also interesting to note here in this Howard College building, this was home to the law faculty. And I remember walking through the building one day, and I came across a big sign advertising um, the Black Law Students Association. And and I remember looking at this and smiling to myself and just trying to imagine the chaos and backlash which would result from someone starting a white law students association. And obviously, a part of me understands why um, why there would be a need for a group like the Black Law Students Association. But for me, what made me smile in that moment, kind of sardonically to myself, was just the extreme double standards um, between the races. Um, that it would be completely politically correct to have a Black Law Students Association, only accepting black people. Um, but if we had the exact same thing, but for a different race, it would be an outrage, a complete scandal. And and to me, it's just ironic because it's racism. Um, it's discrimination based on race, and that's it. Regardless of whether or not it's correct or it makes sense, or um, because of trying to correct past wrongs, whatever the justification is, the fact is it's still discriminating based on race. I can't join. I wouldn't be able to join that, assuming I was a law student, because I'm white, which is the definition of racism as far as I'm aware. Um, so after university, I joined the workforce, like most people do, and I was confronted with another interesting aspect of affirmative action, which is something I mentioned previously, BEE, Black Economic Empowerment. And uh, this was set up to compensate for years of discrimination, systemic racism, and oppression towards blacks. And one of the policies implemented by this BEE was a racial quota system. So if if you had a company that wanted to engage with the government, so for example, if you wanted to apply and win um, government grants, tenders, you need to have a specific BEE score, which was calculated based on the makeup of your employees. So, for example, black females would have the highest score, whereas white males would have the lowest score. So, as a white male who had no part to play in apartheid, who only experienced legacy racism secondhand, and who was completely integrated into this new rainbow nation of Mandela's South Africa, I felt increasingly discriminated against and really like an outsider in my own country. And it felt quite unjust to penalize and punish me for just because I happen to be white, and for the actions of people that just happen to look like me in the past. It's also interesting to note that although there was also much discrimination and oppression during apartheid towards the large Indian and Asian populations, the only reparations are towards the black population. And one other thing that I think is interesting to make mention of is that this corrective action continues to exist in South Africa today, 3 decades after the end of apartheid. This might be particularly controversial, um, but I often hear people criticizing what's called or what's referred to as racial profiling as something that's inherently racist and linking it with police brutality. So I don't want to suggest that there isn't police brutality, there absolutely is, or that racism doesn't exist within the police force, because it absolutely does. But I think it's wrong to say that statistics are racist just because they present an uncomfortable reality which doesn't fit with modern political correctness. I had a large number of frightening encounters where I was really afraid for my life. And unfortunately, all of these incidents um, involved African men. So, for example, one evening I was at a friend's place watching television, and his parents were out. There was just my friend, myself, and his sister and brother in law. I was 20 at the time, and around halfway through the film, we heard this beeping sound, beep, 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 from the alarm system. And that was the specific beep code for signaling that the outside um, beams had been triggered. So in the garden, they had these beams, point-to-point beams, like lasers, and if someone walked between these, the beam would be interrupted, and it would send a signal back to the central alarm system, which would then set off the alarm, this discrete little beeping noise. So we heard this noise. His brother-in-law got up, looked out the window, and told us, switch off the lights and hide under the beds, because there's 3 black men with guns looking through the windows encircling the house. So we quickly turned off the lights, went into the parents' bedroom, hid under the bed, and called the security company. They told us they couldn't come because they only had one security car in the area, and it was up the road from us, dealing with a mass shooting. Some people had gone into the house up the road, broken in, killed everyone in the house. So they said, very sorry, we're dealing with that, we can't help you. So we phoned the police, and it really felt like an eternity, but eventually they arrived. And the police came. I just remember waiting for the police, thinking, I'm going to die, I'm going to get shot or beaten up and then shot, but tonight I'm going to die. And I thought that because there had been this recurring incidents of young black men taking this mixture of different drugs, breaking into houses of white people, killing everyone, stealing their valuables, and I was convinced this is now what's going to happen to us. So after what felt like an eternity, the police eventually arrived. They searched the premises, couldn't find them, eventually left, and so we went back to watching television. A few minutes later, beep, 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 we heard the alarm again. Looked out the window, saw them again, same thing. This time we locked ourselves in the bathroom, phoned the police. They came back, and this time they brought the canine unit, so the police dogs. And the dogs found them, and they were hiding in the shed in the garden. And it turned out that they were the same people that had gone up the street, broken into the house, killed everyone, and they were hiding now in the garden at my friend's house. And so this was one incident, and there were a few incidents like that during my life, and this really impacted me and my perception of the races. How could it not? If every time that you feel your life is in danger and there is a specific type of person involved, you're going to just form a correlation, an association in your mind. So shortly after moving out of my family's house, I got involved in sign language as a volunteer interpreter. And I spent over 7 years working with the deaf in various capacities and roles. Now in South Africa, the deaf community is quite unique. And the vast majority of black people in South Africa are black. And many of which became deaf as a result of lack of modern medical care or from dangerous practice from witch doctors, which are called sangomas in South Africa. And for these children that are either born deaf or become deaf early on, um, it's a traditional belief in South Africa um, that a deaf child is a curse from your ancestors, so from your dead parents, grandparents, and so on. So this, the Africans, many of them, they incorporate ancestral worship into their religious practice. So, for example, in South Africa, there is this kind of um, it's like a sect or a branch of Christianity called Zionism, where they incorporate a lot of traditional beliefs and ancestral worship into ideas um, from Judaism, Christianity. But in any case, these traditional ideas, um, traditional lore says that the deaf children are a result of a curse put upon the family by the ancestors. And so as a result, these children are terribly maltreated and often hidden away out of embarrassment from the rest of the community. So some children that I met and worked with, they were tied up outside as animals. Some were kept locked away in a room in the house, and many were never given any education at all. I remember once meeting a 47-year-old deaf man who was working for a Catholic family, and he had never had any kind of education. He had never learned sign language, and effectively this man had never been exposed to any language, had never had a conversation with another human in his life. And his only connection to the world was a small television in his room, which he would watch with obviously limited understanding. And so a friend of mine and myself, we would go visit him once a week. We eventually convinced this Catholic couple to allow us to teach him sign language, and it was quite difficult. We used picture books, and so we would point to the picture, show him the sign. We'd go outside, show him a tree, do the sign for a tree, show him a flower, do the sign for a flower, and so on. And little by little, he started to be able to replicate the signs, and he started to put signs together and eventually make phrases. And finally, he was able to one day communicate to us and kind of tell us the story of his life and how he was bitten by a snake as a small child. He went deaf, and his family abandoned him. He lived on the streets by himself, and eventually started working for different people at their house. And it was just so moving and so emotional, seeing this man after almost 5 decades of his life for the first time being able to express himself with language. Um, but it was very sad to see how much suffering was caused from these traditional beliefs. There was another deaf black man that I met. He was in his late 30s, and one day he asked if we could help him translate for his mother. So two of us interpreters, we went with him to his family home to help him speak with his mother. And this was in a very rural area. We couldn't get to the house by car. We had to walk up this hill. Anyway, so we arrived, and when we were there, he explained to us that this was going to be the very first conversation he'd ever had with his mother. And it turned out that all he wanted to know was why his father left when he was a child and what happened to his father. Also a very emotional, very moving experience, and just so difficult to identify with the disdain that the parents have for the child just because it's deaf. During the same period of my life, I also volunteered at a school for the deaf during my postgraduate studies in psychology, And I worked with the deaf children in group play therapy and one-on-one counseling sessions. And I also participated in workshops with different government agencies to help adapt different psychological instruments or tools for deaf children. Um, because so the language is different. So um, you know, moving from one language to another, generally in um, psychometrics or psychological tests or instruments, um, you have to make sure that there's the same kind of validity, conceptual validity or statistical validity between the different languages across the different items of the instrument. And so um, up until that time, they'd never considered thinking about doing tests and using sign language. They were only using English, which is obviously not the native language of deaf children. Um, and so, and also because of these traditional beliefs, the whole cultural context is very different for these children. And actually, during my postgraduate studies, I was working on a master's dissertation was looking at the support structures um, between deaf children um, and hearing children, because what I noticed working in these deaf schools was that because of these traditional beliefs, there was such a huge um, distance between the children and their parents that there was almost no relationship, or if there was a relationship, it was quite quite negative and harmful. And so these deaf children didn't have the same kind of familial structures that the hearing children had, and so they developed huge reliance and dependencies on teachers, on social workers, on others involved in the educational system. Um, and what was also quite striking, so at the school that I was working at, they offered free sign language lessons for parents of deaf children. And um, at the beginning of the school year, there might be 3 or 4 parents that attended, but by the third lesson, there were no more parents that attended. And um, every single black deaf child that I saw in a therapeutic context um, told me the same thing there, that their parents, their family couldn't speak sign language. Maybe there was sometimes a brother or sister or even a cousin that learned a bit of sign language, but the parents did not learn sign language. They did not communicate with the child. Um, what sometimes would happen is the parents would communicate with the teachers, who would then translate into sign language for the children. Um, anyway, it was very, very sad, very difficult. A lot of these children had severe problems. It was very difficult to get treatment or help for them because um, I think I only had found one other psychologist in South Africa who did sign language. Um, it was very, very difficult to find resources, therapeutic resources for the deaf. Um, Unfortunately, it wasn't only the children that were mistreated, black deaf children, but also the black deaf adults, and they were systematically taken advantage of, dismissed, mistreated, abused. One incident which really shocked me involved a deaf lady who had just given birth, and she asked me to take her to hospital for a baby to have a checkup, and wanted me there to help interpret for her. And towards the end of the checkup, the nurse got out a syringe and went to inject the mother. And I I asked her to stop, and I asked the mother, "Do you know what she's doing to you?" And she said, "No." So I asked the nurse, "What are you doing? What are you injecting into her?" And the nurse, who was also a black lady, she said that This was to stop her from having any more children. So essentially, she was trying to chemically castrate her, or make her chemically castrate this deaf woman without her consent. And for me, it was just a huge shock to to just assume it was okay to make such a gigantic decision on behalf of another person just because they're deaf. I lost my temper, and I told the nurse it's illegal what she's doing. It's medically unethical, and that she's going to lose her medical license. It was hugely shocking, and it's terrifying to think that that it was a surprise to the nurse that I said this, that in that culture it's just almost a given that, well, they're deaf, probably they shouldn't be having children, that they can't make any decisions, they can't think for themselves. It's very shocking, very very difficult. In my 20s, I then met a French woman, and we got married in South Africa in 2014. And the following year, we decided to move to France for numerous reasons. But 3 months before leaving South Africa, um, the king of the Zulu people, his name's Goodwill Zwelithini, he made a statement um, that the problems in South Africa were due to foreigners, specifically other African foreigners, coming into South Africa, taking jobs, engaging in criminal behavior. And very shortly after that statement, there were terrible weeks of xenophobic attacks by the Zulus against other Africans. And people were being dragged out of their houses, into the streets, attacked with machetes, and burnt. Um, the official reports greatly downplayed what was happening. Um, Within the local community of sign language interpreters, we dealt with many deaf people from other African countries who had made their way into South Africa in hopes for a better life, or for themselves, and obviously for their families as well. And we had to make arrangements for them to be hidden during these attacks, and thankfully none of them got harmed. But this left very many of them traumatized, and the the violence reached a point where Zulus were even attacking and killing other Zulus who didn't look Zulu; they looked foreign. Um, and during all of this, my wife and I were living in a small apartment building on the top of a hill that overlooked the center of Durban. And from this apartment, we could look down over the city and see the fires and hear the screams and the gunshots and the sirens. And it was horrific. So I then moved to France in September of 2015, and it was quite a significant culture shock for me. And the first thing I noticed was how much more relaxed I was in general. In South Africa, we're constantly on edge, hyper vigilant, always suspicious and expecting things to go sideways. But now, living in France, I realized just how high my base level of stress was while in South Africa. Um, but despite that, I found the French people quite cold relative to South Africans, who are generally very warm, friendly, sociable. Um, and when the Europeans would learn that I'm from South Africa, many of them would ask me if I'm racist. They seem to assume if you're from South Africa, you're racist. Um, just because the only thing they know, like I said, about South Africa is apartheid and Mandela. And so they would make comments about how racist South Africa was, and South Africans by extension. I assume this is only because of the limited knowledge and preconceptions. But what I found very ironic was how racist it was that I was being judged based on my nationality. I also found it ironic that the same people who were assuming South Africans were racist were the same people making terrible generalizations and racist comments about foreign immigrants and refugees in France, and not to mention their opinions about people in the neighboring countries of Germany, Switzerland, and Belgium. Another interesting thing which struck me after a few years of living here in France, um, I wasn't sure that I actually knew any French people. So all of my French friends had parents that were from all over Europe, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, um, even further abroad. So my wife, for example, her father was from Spain, her mother's family, I think, from Holland, from the Netherlands. Um, other French friends, their parents were from Algeria, Tunisia, and so it seemed like one's Frenchness is more a state of mind than anything else because with all the European borders now open, there's this huge big mixture of nationalities, and so what does it mean anymore to be French? It's not something genetic um, or due to your pedigree or family history. It's really almost like a mental construct, one could say, more than anything that can be linked um, to something physical. So I've now gone through quite a few anecdotes, information about my life to try and frame and give context to the way in which I see race, in which I interpret racism. Um, I'm now going to pause a bit, and in the follow-up video, I'm going to then, based on my context, on my past, my history, share some reflections on how I see modern racism today, and and then I'd like to end with something a bit more positive, so a way forward, so some thoughts about where do we go from here, um, how do we fix this problem. So I hope to see you in the next video, and thanks for watching.